Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the tiebreakers being played in the grand finale of the FIDE World Cup in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, as you guys know, Magnus Carlsen and Ramesh Babu Praggnanandahaa drew both of their classical games, and today we are going to have some history. Either the former world champion Magnus is going to win the FIDE World Cup for the first time in his career, or we're going to have the scintillating sensation Ramesh Babu Praggnanandahaa beating Fabiano Caruana, Hikaru and Magnus Carlsen, the top three players in the world, to win the event. So let's jump right into the action. Now, as you guys know, the format pretty much the same as always, playing 2 games of rapid chess with 25 minutes and a 10-second increment. So in game number 1, Prag gets the white pieces here, and this does put some pressure on him, as obviously he needs to try and exert some pressure, but most importantly, he needs to try and keep things under control, because a loss in game 1 would most likely be fatal, because he would have to win the second game with the black pieces. All right, so the game starts with e4. We get e5 from Magnus, knight to f3 from Prag, knight to c6, bishop c4, all very standard, the very classic Gucci piano, which has been played in chess for the last 600 years. We get knight f6, d3, bishop c5, a4, all very standard so far, d6 castles, and now we get a5 from Magnus, basically trying to stop white from creating a lot of space on the queen side. If you do play a6, this is a line, but white can always play something like c3 and b4 to really expand here on the queen side and get these pawns rolling up the board. So we get a5 here. Prag plays bishop e3, Magnus trades, and now he castles. We get knight d2, knight to e7, knight to h4, and now Magnus plays the move c6. Now in this position, white has a very nice bishop on c4, targeting this long diagonal towards the pawn on f7 as well as the king on g8. So black has a couple of options. One is to try and play d5. Now this is a little bit less effective, because at some point after bishop b3, if you take, you reopen the diagonal. After say knight e4, takes, because now white has this great bishop spying the pawn. Another option here is to play bishop e6. Now this I think is relatively okay too, but after bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and say a move like queen f3 with the idea of queen to h3, I think the play here is a little bit easier for white in general, because after knight c6, queen h3, the pawn on e6 is a little bit weak, and after say queen e7, knight f3, it's really unclear whether you want to play d5 and create this weakness or not. At any rate, I think black will have to use time and come up with a plan, and Magnus simply doesn't want to play something so static. So here we get c6 here. Magnus comes up with another idea, which is after queen to e1, he plays this d5 move attacking the bishop, and if white ever trades the pawns, now you get this nice big black center with pawns on e5 and d5, and after bishop b3, we now get this move queen to d6. Now one interesting thing here about bishop b3 is the computer actually thinks you should play bishop e6, so that on queen to g3 you can go knight to d7 here, and now the knights guard these central pawns on e5 and d5 while you finish your development by getting this bishop out. Whereas if you play, say, queen d6, queen g3, knight d7, now how do you activate this light square bishop? So it would have been a little bit better to play bishop e6. At any rate, it is a rapid game. Magnus already down a little bit of time, trying to play quickly and catch up on the clock. So he does play queen e6, which is a slight mistake. After queen e6, we get queen to g3 from Prag, trying to activate the queen, put more pressure on both the f and the g files. Magnus plays knight to h5, we get queen g5, and now Magnus makes a fairly serious mistake by playing the move pawn to g6. Now in this position, the computer wants knight to f6, and during my live stream on Kick, I was actually worried we might get a repetition with queen g3, knight h5, and the game would end in a draw, but instead Magnus says no and plays the move g6. Now on first glance, this move makes a lot of sense because it guards the knight, but it's a serious blunder here because white can play the move pawn to d4, exploding the center of the board here, and after say pawn takes, and bishop e6 here, white can now play the move c3, creating the big white center here. If you ever take on e4 after knight takes e4, let's say queen d7, white has knight c5 hitting the bishop and the queen, and after queen d6, knight e6, f6, and rook e1, suddenly white has a lot of pressure on the e file. Now, one thing that, for whatever reason, again, I don't want to call it luck, and I know a lot of people will say I'm being salty or something, but one of the things that's amazing about Magnus's games is somehow in critical moments, people always make quick moves when they have victory or a big advantage within their grasp. Two specific examples from the World Cup are Magnus's game against Vincent Keimer in the second classical game, where Vincent spent 30 seconds in a position to trade queens, when if he had played this critical move, knight takes e4, he almost certainly would have won the game. I mean, at least not lost. Maybe he wouldn't have won, maybe it would have been a draw, but he would definitely not lost the game and advanced the next round. Alas, he didn't do it. And also in the semifinal match between Magnus Carlsen and Nijat Abasov, Abasov at a critical moment had this move queen to f1, which probably would have won him the game. Instead, he played the move rook g6 after, I believe, 20 to 30 seconds. And in this game, we have the same situation where after g6, Pragg plays this move knight to f5 after about 25 seconds, and it is a very serious mistake because it throws away the entire advantage. So if Pragg had played d4 here or knight to f3, probably would have kept a big advantage. Knight f3 a little bit less so, because after f6, queen to h4 and bishop e6, to me at least, it doesn't seem obvious why white is much better, since black is this great center here with the pawns on c6 and f6 specifically guarding the two central pawns. But nonetheless, computer likes it. If Pragg had played d4, however, I think there's a very, very good chance that Pragg would have won this game. Instead, he plays knight to f5, and now Magnus is able to take and go king g7. Now, another point is that in rapid, it's very tricky because what you're trying to do is you're trying to use your time at critical moments in the right way as opposed to the wrong way. So sometimes you want to make moves quickly and not think. Sometimes you want to use your time and find the best move. And there's one situation where, unfortunately for Pragg, he tries to be very quick and build the pressure on the clock. As you can see, he's already up 6 minutes, but Magnus has 12.5 minutes on the clock still. And one thing that I am actually quite guilty of, especially in the last year or so when I play the slower rapid with like 20 to 25 minutes as opposed to the fast rapid with 15 minutes, is in a lot of situations I try to play really fast the first 15-20 moves and then use my time. Whereas I think generally you need to use your time in the first like 15 moves very, very carefully and not move too quickly. And in this case, unfortunately for Pragg, because he's moved so fast, the advantage is gone. So we get king g7, and here Pragg plays king h1. Computer wants rook a e1, which frankly in a rapid game to me is just insane, because after this move pawn to b5, black is trying to play on the queen side here. If you take, now I have a4. One example, say king h1, a4, bishop a2, and rook a c8. Suddenly black has great pawns on the queen side. Your pawn on c2 is weak, and white in general is in a lot of trouble here. Now, the reason the computer thinks this is okay is because after b5, you can just play this quiet move c3, and after, say, rook a b8, maybe now you can go rook a1. And again, this is very, very random computer stuff, which frankly, when you don't have all day to think, just doesn't make sense. And even if you have time to think, I don't think a human would play it, because you're putting the rook on a file behind these pawns. And even if you can get, say, let's say b6 d4, I just go e4. If you go e4, I can always go d4. So why is the rook on a closed file? So to me, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense no matter what. So Pragg plays king h1, and now Magnus plays this great move queen to f6, and now one of the ideas behind rook a e1 is revealed, and that is that if Pragg were to play queen g4 here after knight takes f5, on first glance you think, wait, e4, pin the knight here, win the queen. You move the knight, lose the queen. But after e4, there's this move knight to e3, forking the rook and the queen. If white moves the queen away, you just take the rook here, and you simply have an extra rook for a bishop on the board. And if white actually, I guess if white tries to take the queen here with the rook after knight takes g4, rook f1, let's just say knight f6, black simply is an extra pawn in the center of the board. This pawn at f7, and black should win the game. But now we see why rook e1 makes sense, because in this position, after rook e1, queen f6, queen g4, if knight takes f5, e4 occurs, now there is no longer a knight e3 trick here because the rook covers the square. And after, say, knight h6, queen d7, white is actually a little bit better in this position. So again, very, very dank, very deep, but I don't think you can ever be critical of Pragg for not playing rook e1 because it just simply is not a human move. But the problem is that after we get this position with queen f6, now Pragg has to trade the queens here, and after knight takes f6, we've reached an endgame where, first of all, Magnus has two knights versus a bishop and knight, and I cannot stress enough that in rapid and blitz, generally, if you have knights versus a bishop and knight, if the bishop does not have obvious threats on open diagonals, it's almost always easier to play with the knights versus the bishop and the knight. Furthermore, black also is a big center here with the pawns on e5, d5, c6, and b7, the BBC as we like to call it. And after h takes g6, or fg6, hg6, now black also has the pawns connected. So down the road, if black can, say, get f6 here, you'll notice that all black's pawns are connected, whereas white has these 5 connected, but these 2 are split, and the pawn structure is very favorable to black, and the bishop on b3 is simply staring at a dead pawn wall. So Pragg plays e4, a great thematic move here, trying to rip open the diagonal for this bishop on b3. Now we get d takes e4 from Magnus, d takes e4, and now at least with the bishop on this diagonal, white has quite a bit of play because it will always be spying the pawn, and you can't close the diagonal with knight d5 ever because I simply take your knight. So we get rook a d8, Pragg goes rook f2 here, guarding the knight. You do not really want to move the knight away because then you will potentially lose the pawn on e4. So you get rook f2, guards the knight, which guards the pawn, and you can double stack to pressure the pawn on the f7 square. So it looks like white is doing okay here. So Magnus plays rook d4, and this is actually a bit of a mistake here from Magnus. It would be interesting to find out why exactly he played this move, whether he maybe miscalculated something or what the reasoning was, because to me it seemed pretty obvious that you should play knight d7, trying to put the knight on c5 to fork the pawns on e4 and a4. At any rate, rook d4 is played. We get rook a f1, and now Magnus goes knight to g8. You have to move this knight back. If you were to move the knight away after rook takes f7, white has the kebab on the 7th rank, and it's simply GG, why not? So we get knight g8 to guard the knight. Pragg plays the move c3, a nice move here, creating space for the bishop to retreat, as well as forcing the rook away from the square. So now there's not as much pressure on the pawn in e4 anymore. So Magnus goes rook d7 to guard the pawn, and now he intends to move the knight off of the f6 square. Pragg plays the move rook to e2. We get rook to e7, and now bishop c2 played here with the idea of moving the knight to c4 on the next turn. Now bishop c2 is probably fine, but knight c4 right away would have probably been a little bit better, simply because you don't really need to move the bishop. And after say rook a8, you can go back with bishop c2, maybe play knight d6, but at any rate you have the extra option available. Whereas once you put the bishop on c2, it's not really doing anything other than guarding the pawn, but the rook is already simply guarding the pawn on e4. So we get bishop c2, knight d7 by Magnus, knight c4. Now we get rook to a8, guarding the pawn. Not b6 here, by the way, because then after a move like rook d2, now the knight has to stay on the square to guard the pawn on b6. So this pawn on b6 and the pawn on a5 are always big liabilities for black. So we get rook a8. Now g4 played by Pragg. Now g4 to me was maybe not the best move position, but a very pragmatic move, pun unintended, because now it's not so clear how black can develop easily. If you play knight f6 and white goes to h3 here, suddenly the pawns are actually quite decent on h3 and g4. White can go rook f2, and Magnus, also sensing this, plays the move f6 instead to try and guard the pawn in e5. And here Praggnanandahaa plays an amazing move, which is rook g2. Now I thought this was an excellent move, played under a lot of pressure, because one thing that matters a lot in rapid, also in blitz of course, but more so in rapids, as you're getting lower on the clock towards the end of the game, since you start with so much time, you have to shift gears, and you cannot end up down too much time on the clock, because if you do and you don't have obvious moves, you're gonna have to spend time while your opponent can make instant moves, and when that happens, it's very difficult to play. So after rook g2, Magnus plays knight h6, and now Pragg gets g5. And as you'll notice here, at this point before rook g2, Magnus is up about 40 seconds. Magnus is in good shape on the clock, but after rook g2, he has to spend a lot of time on this knight h6 move, because suddenly, as he realizes after g5 comes in and we get the pawn trade, suddenly white has obvious ideas of stacking the rooks, or maybe putting the rooks on the d file, and suddenly Magnus has to use his time here, whereas before it was a one-way street where he had the instant replies to whatever Pragg's plan was. So we get knight f7, rook g2, and now Magnus plays rook to e6 here, guarding the pawn on g6 against any ideas like rook to g1. And now Pragg plays this move rook to d2, which is a great move, but Pragg used nearly half his time here, a minute and a half. At this point, the time is even, and I will say, not to spoil it, but after rook d2, with the time usage, I think from here on out it becomes very difficult for Pragg to play. And looking back, I think this is a very serious mistake in this game from Pragg. I think this is a move, specifically the time usage, that cost him this first game of the match. So we get rook d2, and now we have rook to f6 being played by Magnus, a move that's played very quickly, an excellent move from Magnus. He's very happy to trade the rooks on f6 here. Pragg trades, but now the problem is that in the long term, white doesn't have any plan here. The knights on f6 and f7 cover these critical squares. I mean, once again, these knights are simply better than the knight on c4 and the bishop on c2 in the long run, and it's very hard for white to come up with a plan. Really, the only plan that white has here is to maybe play for b4 and attack on the queen side. So we get b4 here, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Magnus goes king to f8, trying to bring the king to the center of the board to cover these two squares so that there are no kebabs or any forks on d6 or d7, and these knights are perfectly placed. So we get king g2 from Pragg. Magnus goes king e7, we get a5, and now Magnus plays this move rook to h8, and now it's all starting to go downhill. At this point, Magnus has all the obvious moves, and to compound matters or make them worse, Magnus is also up 2 minutes on the clock, and at this point, even though the computer still thinks this is equal, I think that in a rapid game of chess, it's borderline impossible to defend, as we will see. Pragg plays rook to e2. Magnus goes knight to h5. Now, computer thinks that after bishop d3, rook h4, rook b2, white is still doing okay because you just play for moves like takes, take, actually not take, sorry. After knight e4, you can go b5 to try and trade off these pawns on the queen side, and white still should be able to save the game. But again, you're very low on time. Bishop d3 is not an obvious move for many reasons. First of all, there's rook h4 to attack the pawn, and you have to spot the rook b2 idea. Additionally, there are moves like rook to d8, pinning the bishop on d3 potentially, and it just doesn't make any sense at all. So it's very hard to play this, and Pragg just goes rook e2 instead, trying to guard the pawn and intending to try and move the bishop away so he does not hang this pawn on e4. And now Magnus starts to jump all over him. He plays knight h5 here with the idea of knight f4 to fork the king and the rook. We get king to g1 from Pragg. Magnus goes knight f4. We get rook to d2, and now he plays rook h3, and now the rook is infiltrating on the third rank. The knight can go to g5 and f3, and it's starting to become a complete disaster. Now, amazingly, the computer still thinks that after, say, bishop d1 and rook c3, rook c2, black is actually now starting to change his mind. Now starting to think that black is actually quite a bit better, but maybe you can still save the game. But again, with 18 seconds on the clock versus 2 minutes and 50 in a situation where Magnus has these knights and very obvious ideas with the knight and the rook, it's simply impossible to defend because white has no obvious ideas, no obvious ways to get counterplay either. So Pragg here finally cracks and plays a6. Again, I don't think any human here would draw this with white, including Magnus, considering the time situation here. Doesn't matter. Magnus would play me, play Fabiano. I think even if Magnus is white here with 18 seconds versus 250, he would lose probably 99% of the time, just like anyone else would. So at this point, you can't fault Pragg for playing a6. But after pawn takes pawn, we get bishop to a4. Now Magnus plays rook c3, attacking the knight. Pragg goes knight a5, trying desperately to get some counterplay here with the bishop and the knight on the rim. But now these knights start jumping. We get knight g5, threatening knight f3 to fork the king and the rook. We get rook to c2 from Pragg, and now Magnus uses a little bit of time, and this is why having time really is critical at the end, because in this position there are many ways for white or for black to be better, but Magnus uses about 30 seconds and finds the killer blow with knight g to h3. We get king to f1, and now rook to a3 effectively ends the game, because the bishop is under attack, and no matter where you move the bishop, say you take after rook to a1, these knights cover all the critical squares. The king cannot move forward, and after rook c1, it's simply checkmate. GG, why not? So Pragg plays knight takes c6, but after king f6, he resigns the game simply because you can't really stop checkmate without giving up the bishop, and after king e1, rook takes a4 with an extra knight on the board. Magnus should win this in his sleep. So a very, very tough first game for Pragg. He held firm for a long time, but he ended up in one of these end games where, unfortunately, at the critical moments, all the moves, the flow was in Magnus's favor, and that is one of the most substantial differences between rapid chess and classical. So a very tough loss for Pragg. He held tough for a long time. Obviously, he's going to rue not playing the move d4 on move number 15. But alas, in a rapid game, it's all about a couple of critical moments. So a very tough loss for Pragg in game number 1. And let's move on to game number 2. Now, in game number 2, Pragg has the black pieces. Having lost with the white pieces in game 1, he's in a situation where he must win at all costs. And as I said myself, when you're in a situation where you have to win with the black pieces against a top player, it's absolutely miserable because there are a lot of openings you can't play. So Magnus plays e4 as usual, and Pragg plays the Sicilian. Now, I would honestly say that in a must-win situation with black, there are very few options that exist. You can play g6 or d6 like I did against Pragg, but excluding those moves, the only moves that I would say that you can really try to play for a win are d5 or c5, specifically because if you play e5, white can always play the 4-knight Scotch, which we actually saw. I guess Magnus played bishop b5 in the game yesterday, but the 4-knight Scotch, it's borderline impossible to win if your opponent doesn't want to let you, as we saw in the World Cup match between Daniele Vocaturo and Danil Dubov earlier, where Dubov went into his 4 knights with black in a must-win situation, got absolutely nothing, and was actually, I think, a little bit lucky to draw the game. So you can't really play e5. So if you play the French, white can play d4, d5, and play the exchange French, and generally speaking, this should be pretty drawish in general. Not to say you can't get chances to win against certain players, but on average, this will peter out to a draw. And if you play the Carlsen, white can always play this exchange, turn it into the Panov, and generally the best line by modern theory here is to play this line with bishop g4, but after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and let's move queen b3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, e6, queen b7, knight d4, bishop b5, takes queen c6. Generally speaking, according to modern theory, you reach an endgame like this where effectively black has no chance to win either. This, of course, was featured in many of the famous Botvinnik matches during the World Championships and other famous USSR championships during the 1940s and 1950s, I believe it was, as well. I might do a video on something like this down the road. So if you can't really play the French, you can't play the Carlsen, You can't really play e5. Sicilian is the most obvious choice. So Pragg trying to channel his inner Italiano by playing the Siciliano, and now Magnus plays c3, the Alpin or the c3 Sicilian. Now Magnus played this in the second classical game against D Gukesh in, I believe, the quarterfinals, where Gukesh had to try and win with the black pieces, and I think it's one of the most solid approaches in general. Having said that, Pragg did beat Arjun in this Alpin in the second classical game of their semifinal quarterfinal match, I think it was, when Arjun only needed to draw with the white pieces. So he gets c3, knight f6, e5, knight d5, knight f3, knight c6, d4 takes, bishop c4, knight b6, bishop b3, and now Pragg plays d6. It's a shame he didn't go d5, because then we at least would have seen end peasant with pawn takes pawn. Either way, regardless of whether black plays d5 or d6, white will take the pawn. So we get takes, castles, and now Pragg plays the move bishop f5. Now I'll tell you guys a fun story. My older brother, who is about a master level player, very strong chess player, he actually played this Alpin Sicilian for his entire life from the time he started. So I remember all the way back in the late 90s, I want to say around like 1997 maybe, I was looking at some of these variations with bishop e6, and in the early days of computers actually initially thought this line with queen to e2, bishop e3, rook d1, and knight d2, takes, queen e2 is actually very good for black, if not winning. But after queen takes b2 and queen e4, white is actually one of winning according to modern day computers. So this is a line that I studied a lot when I was younger. Actually, I remember even when I was 10 years old, the line that I concluded to be the best here after queen h4 was to play this move h5. And I think the idea was that if white plays like bishop e3, you can go queen g4 to trade the queens. But again, even if you get this position's objectively equal, and you're not really going to get winning chances. So Pragg decides instead to play bishop f5. If you're trying to keep the game alive, I really feel like bishop f5 and or maybe g6 are the only options. Now g6 is objectively bad, but at least after knight a3, a6, knight to g5, e6, knight e4, queen d8, the game is a little bit chaotic here. Now the computer thinks white is actually much better with perfect play, but the game is chaotic, and as I said before, if you lose here, it doesn't matter, because the only result that takes you to the promised land is a win. So Pragg decides to play bishop f5 instead, rather than playing bishop e6, which, just to be clear for anyone who's a theoretician, that is the move that objectively equalizes. So we get bishop f5, we get knight takes d4 from Magnus, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and now we have e6 being played here. And now Magnus goes knight c3, Pragg plays bishop e7, and already here after queen to f3, it's looking very, very difficult for Pragg to create chances. Now, during my live stream, I already said that at this point, I thought that Pragg was going to get 0 chances and the game would end very quickly, because the only imbalance in the position is the pawns on d4 and e6. Very similar to my recap of the Gukesh game, where white got this isolated pawn. If white can ever get rid of the isolated pawn, for example, say you get some position like this, just to illustrate the point, when you have a symmetrical pawn structure, there are pretty much no chance of losing. Generally speaking, if you have balanced material and pawns on the same files, for the most part, it's very, very difficult if it's not, say, all the pawns are on the board. If you have like 4 or 5 pawns and they're all in the same files, generally most games are going to end in a draw no matter what. So we get queen f3 from Magnus here, not d5 by the way, because after d5, I think, well, actually d5 might have been good enough anyway, but queen f3 is a little bit more aggressive to put pressure on the pawn on b7. Pragg decides to castle, and now Magnus goes d5, getting rid of the one weakness in the position, creating pawns on all the same files. And at this point, it's already very, very clear that Magnus is not going to lose this game. If anyone has chance to win here, it will be Magnus. So after d5, Pragg plays bishop g6, retreating the bishop, because if you were to play pawn takes pawn, you simply hang the bishop on f5. So we get bishop g6, Magnus trades on e6, and now he goes queen e2, playing against this weak pawn on the e6 square, as well as this long diagonal. Pragg goes king to h8, and now Magnus takes on e6. Now, if Magnus were in a situation where he had to win this game, there's a very good chance he would have played something like rook d1, queen b4, and bishop e3 to keep the game going, and the computer likes white's position a lot here. But in a situation where Magnus does not need to win the game, there is no need to be crazy. Get the draw and get out of town and finish the event. So Magnus takes the pawn on e6 with the queen. We get queen takes queen, bishop takes, and bishop c5, which is the best move here. Pragg is hoping that Magnus will play a random move like a3, because after bishop d3, suddenly black has a lot of pressure here. Once you move the rook, there's bishop f2, king h1, and say bishop c2, and suddenly black is actually a little bit better. But unfortunately, after bishop c5 here, Magnus has this move bishop to e3, which basically blunts any threats on this diagonal by offering the trade of the bishops. So here Pragg has to trade. We get pawn takes and rook f8 here. Pragg is temporarily down a pawn, but he will win the pawn back on e3 on the next turn when white moves his bishop. So Magnus goes bishop b3. we get rook takes e3, Magnus plays rook a e1, and Pragg after rook takes e1 offers a draw, and Magnus of course gladly accepts because a draw is good enough for him to win the World Cup. Now the conclusion, if this game had continued, would have been rook takes rook, and here Pragg would have had to play rook e8, and after takes knight d5 for example, Pragg would have had to trade the knights, play b6 a3, and with the opposite colored pawns here, let's just say we get to this position, we would have gotten the exact same situation where after h6 g3, all the pawns are on the opposite colors of the bishops, exact same situation as in game 2 of the classical portion of the match, and neither side can do anything and the game will end in a draw. If you don't play rook e8, if you play a move like rook to d8, again I can go rook to e7, threatening the kebab on the 7th rank, and you have to play rook d7, and after the trade, once again, this endgame with the bishop and the knights on the board, pretty much no chance due to the symmetrical pawns. No chance for either side really to win. Actually, maybe if anyone has a chance, maybe it's white here even, but for black at least no chances. So that's why Pragg offers a draw after rook takes e1 before Magnus can move, and with that draw, Magnus does win the FIDE World Cup. First time in his career that he has won the event. A fantastic result. He comes through when it matters. Really clutch from Magnus, and he shows once again why he is the best player in the world. So overall, great result for Magnus. Obviously some hiccups. Probably should have lost to Vincent Keimer in that critical matchup. Vincent didn't see knight takes e4. It is what it is. But other than that one moment, I don't really think we can say that Magnus was in much danger. Maybe Abasov, there's a queen f1, but again, that was a move that had to be played in order for Abasov to have a chance. So Magnus really was only in danger at one time during the event. He was able to overcome it. He was able to win on demand in that second game against Vincent. So overall, a mostly smooth performance for Magnus, a very deserved win for him. Now, on the other side, you have Praggnanandahaa, who obviously is going to be a little bit disappointed that he was not able to win today. But overall, he had a fantastic event. He beat yours truly. He also beat Fabiano Caruana, so he beat the number 2 and number 3 players in the world. And really, he came up a little bit short today, but it's hard to really be unhappy. And the future is going to be very, very bright for him. Additionally, I think it can't be understated how big it is for chess to see these Indian juniors doing so well today on the YouTube live stream. I think at some point there were over 200,000 people watching. I don't know how many of them are Indians, but a great majority must have been. And so it's great to see the Indian contingent supporting their players, whether it be Arjun, whether it be Gukesh, whether it be Praggnanandahaa, whether it of course be the one man who started all the legend himself, Viswanathan, the 5-time world champion. It is great to see the enthusiasm they have for chess, and it bodes very well for the future, both for chess but also for India. With all these juniors, I'm quite confident that some of them are going to break through and make the top 5, if not contest the world championship with all the top players who are currently up there today. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below, and I'll be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. And last but not least, it's been a great run covering this World Cup, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it. So that's that. See you guys. Bye.